Voices from the well. The midnight. Moans. I first heard the moans on a muggy summer night. I'd been lying awake in my cramped bedroom, windows open to invite in the rare breeze. The old clock on my nightstand read 12:07 a.m. when the noise reached my ears. A slow, mournful wail that drifted in through the curtains. At first, I thought I was imagining things. It could have been the wind through the hollow sycamores at the edge of my yard, or a lonely dog howling down the street. But these moans felt different. They carried a resonance that vibrated in my bones, twisting my stomach into uneasy knots. Eventually, I got up and peered outside. Through the darkness, I saw the faint silhouette of the centuries-old well, perched like a tall, silent sentinel at the very boundary of our small town. A heavy moon floated above it, casting elongated shadows that seemed alive. That's when the sound came again. Longer this time, raw and anguished. My heart pounded in my ears. It seemed to be coming from that old well. No one had paid attention to the relic in ages. The local rumor mill said the well was filled with rubble, dried up decades ago. But we all knew, deep down, there was something about that place that gave the bravest among us the chills. Even with the windows shut on stormy nights, I'd sometimes dream of lost voices whispering in that direction. Tonight, though, there was no mistaking it. There were voices, a chorus of them, echoing just beneath the surface of midnight. The quiet rumors. All my life, I'd heard stories about the well at the edge of town. Parents told children to stay away, especially after dusk, weaving tales of accursed darkness lurking within. Some said a witch had been thrown down there centuries ago. Others whispered of unfortunates who met their fate during a fever outbreak. We were all taught to avert our eyes whenever we passed by, as if acknowledging it too closely might draw its attention. As a kid, I'd believed it was just local lore. A bit of harmless mythology used to keep kids from playing near a dangerous old structure. But as the years wore on, the rumors only grew stranger. People claimed they heard cries at midnight, though no one could ever find a source. A handful of reckless teens once went out there on a dare, but they came back pale and trembling, refusing to speak of what happened. I'd always been curious, but fear had kept me away. I never once set foot near that well after sunset. Not until now. When that dreadful moan drifted into my bedroom, something stirred in me, stronger than fear, an urgent need to know the truth. The next morning, after a fitful few hours of sleep, I decided to ask around. I wanted to see if anyone else had heard it, or if I was losing my mind. The townspeople were tight-lipped. Some offered nervous smiles. Others shot me warning glances, as if I were treading on sacred, taboo ground. Despite their silence, I could sense their shared dread. Everyone felt it. Whatever lay in that well was growing restless. Convening at the diner. The next day, I met up with my close friend, Mark, at the local diner. He'd been a skeptic his whole life, not one to spook easily. If anyone could give me a clear-headed perspective, it would be him. I slid into a vinyl booth across from Mark, my pulse still fluttering in my chest. "You ever hear anything strange at night?" I asked casually, keeping my voice low. He studied me over his coffee cup. "Strange how? Like moans? Or voices?" I said. "From the well." Mark paused, eyes flicking left and right as if checking for eavesdroppers. "All right," he said quietly. "I thought it was just me, but I've heard them, too. Twice this week. Always around midnight." My heart pounded. "So, you believe something's going on?" He shrugged. "I don't know what it is, but we can't just ignore it." Our conversation drew the attention of an older man sitting 2 stools away at the counter. His name was Mr. Francis, a lifelong resident known for his silent demeanor and cryptic comments. That day, though, he broke his usual silence. "The well is hungry," he murmured, not bothering to turn around. "I've heard it in the night. It calls for the ones who were thrown down there. They never found rest." A chill ran down my spine. Mark and I exchanged glances. Mr. Francis offered no further explanation, just sipped his coffee in somber silence. But the meaning of his words lingered in the air like a stale odor. The well was calling. Moonlit investigation. That night, Mark and I decided we needed proof. something tangible to settle whether we were chasing fables or confronting a genuine horror. Armed with flashlights and a borrowed digital recorder, we trudged out to the old well. The path was barely visible under the waning moon. The grass was tall and wild, brushing against our legs and tangling around our ankles. Somehow, the air felt thicker as we approached, the humidity clinging to our clothes like a cold sweat. We reached the well just before midnight. It was a squat stone structure, the stones darkened with age and streaked by countless years of weather. A wooden cover, splintered at the edges, lay precariously across the opening. Standing there, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though something deep within the earth was aware of my presence. Even the night creatures seemed subdued in this area. The crickets chirped less, the breeze stilled, as if the land itself was holding its breath. Mark set up the recorder. I edged closer to the well, gripping my flashlight so tightly my knuckles whitened. The circle of light played across the rotting wood. I lifted one corner of the cover and shone the beam down into the darkness. First, all I saw was blackness. Then, with slow, creeping certainty, I sensed movement. My skin prickled, heart hammering. There was something down there, or maybe just the thick gloom playing tricks on me. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation that unseen eyes were staring back. We waited, silent, hearts thudding. Then, at exactly midnight, it began, low and guttural, an otherworldly moan that rose up from the depths. I swallowed hard as goosebumps erupted across my flesh. Mark's hand shook as he clutched the recorder. "Do you hear us?" he whispered, leaning over the rim. A moment later, an echoing voice, muffled and distant, drifted upward. "We were taken," echoes of the past. That single, broken phrase struck me with the force of a sledgehammer. My mind raced with questions. Who were we? Who had taken them? The old tales spoke of countless tragedies linked to this well, but no one had a definitive account. Mark and I stood there, frozen. The recorder's tiny red light blinked in the darkness, capturing every second of the eerie silence that followed. Eventually, Mark cleared his throat, voice trembling. "We know you're there," he said, trying to steady himself. "If you can hear us, we want to help." Help? I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Deep down, I wanted no part of what lurked inside that ancient pit. Yet I didn't contradict him. A small part of me, maybe the braver, more foolish part, thought that if these voices were real, they deserved to be heard. A soft, ragged whisper rose up, so faint that our ears strained to catch the syllables. Thrown down, forgotten, the flashlight flickered, casting twisted shadows on the gnarled stones. My breath caught in my throat as I realized we weren't just dealing with a single spirit. There could be many, dozens, even hundreds of souls, lost, trapped below, each with their own tragic story. What began as moans at midnight had evolved into a direct plea. Fear gnawed at the edges of my consciousness, but so did curiosity and empathy. I turned to Mark. "We can't just walk away," I said, though a more sensible part of me screamed that we should run. He nodded. "We have to find out what happened, why they're still here." As we left, the wind picked up, carrying a ghostly chorus that seemed to trail us all the way back home. Unwelcome discoveries. Mark and I spent the next day holed up in my small living room, listening to the recording over and over. The words were clear enough to rule out a trick of the wind or some elaborate prank. There was something undeniably human about the voices, and something else, something that defied explanation. We poured through Old Town records, dusty newspaper clippings, anything we could find. A pattern emerged. Across centuries, people vanished near that well. Buried in the archives was a grim piece of local history. During a particularly brutal period, suspected criminals or those accused of witchcraft had been executed and discarded in the well. Some references even mentioned entire families thrown down in secret if they posed a threat to the town's more powerful figures. These people, they were never put to rest, Mark muttered, his voice heavy with disgust. It's like the town tried to bury its sins. A cold fury churned in my gut. The horror was almost unimaginable. Dozens, possibly hundreds, had been silenced and tossed away, as if their lives meant nothing. and the town's older generations had simply let the stories fade into legend, too afraid or ashamed to confront the truth. As dusk approached, we made a plan. We decided to speak with one of the oldest residents, a woman named Irma, known for her uncanny memory of the town's darker events. If anyone could fill in the missing pieces, it would be her. But as we left to find her, a nagging feeling coiled in my mind. These spirits wanted more than just acknowledgement. They wanted justice or vengeance. Secrets with Irma. Irma lived in a dilapidated Victorian house, its paint peeling from time and neglect. She greeted us at the door with hollow eyes, as if she'd been expecting our visit. Before we could even introduce ourselves, she beckoned us in and led us to a drawing room crowded with dusty antiques. A single lamp cast a weak glow, illuminating the deep lines on Irma's face. "You heard them, didn't you?" she asked, not bothering with pleasantries. Mark nodded. "You know about the well?" She lowered herself into an armchair, coughing softly. "My grandmother used to tell me stories. Stories her grandmother told her. It said the well was once used by a secret council in town. They disposed of anyone who threatened their authority, accused witches, thieves, and political rivals. Entire families, sometimes, to erase any trace of dissent." A wave of nausea rolled through me as Irma's words confirmed our fears. She continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "The spirits remain because they were never given a rightful burial. Their pain and anger have seeped into the stones." I leaned forward, heart pounding. "Is there a way to help them find peace?" Irma closed her eyes. "They must be acknowledged. Their remains must be retrieved and consecrated. But be warned, the well does not easily give up its dead. That place has become a gateway to something darker." Despite the terror twisting my insides, I felt a surge of determination. We had to try. Those voices deserved a release from their eternal torment. Irma's final words, spoken in a hushed tremor, rang in my head long after we left. "If you go down there, you may not return the same." Gathering a team, Mark and I realized we couldn't do this alone. Retrieving remains, if that was even possible, would require manpower, courage, and specialized tools. But who would join us? The townspeople were terrified, and rightfully so. We reached out to a few people we trusted. Sarah, a brave paramedic, Caleb, an amateur historian who'd studied local legends, and Donna, a part-time librarian with a knack for research. One by one, we presented our findings, playing the eerie recording and sharing the documented history of the well's grim past. Their reactions ranged from stunned silence to horrified outrage. But to our relief, they all agreed to help. None of us believed we could simply ignore the voices of those long-forgotten souls. Our plan came together in hushed meetings over the following nights. Gather equipment, ropes, harnesses, headlamps, and protective gear. Descend into the well, which was rumored to be blocked off at some unknown depth. Collect any remains or artifacts we could find. Bring them to the local church for a proper blessing and burial ceremony. Simple in theory, but my stomach clenched every time I pictured ourselves climbing down into that cursed darkness. None of us knew what we might find. Ghosts were one thing, but the idea of physically retrieving bones of potentially hundreds, turned my blood to ice. Yet, as the moans escalated each night, as if they sensed our intentions, I realized something. The well's inhabitants wanted us to come. Whether for salvation or doom, we were being summoned. Preparing for descent. In the days leading up to the descent, we gathered everything we could think of. Sarah insisted on bringing emergency medical supplies. Mark, ever the pragmatist, stocked extra batteries and spare flashlights. Caleb spent hours designing a makeshift winch system that would help us lower ourselves safely. Donna and I researched protective prayers, incantations, anything that might guard our minds from whatever malevolence resided down there. Even though my rational mind balked at the idea of magical protection, a part of me felt it couldn't hurt. If there was something supernatural at play, I wanted every advantage we could get. The night before we planned to enter the well, I couldn't sleep. The moans had intensified. They seemed to shake the walls of my room. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw the skeletal remains of those cast into darkness centuries ago. reaching up with bony hands. I heard their whispers in the silence. Help us. Release us. By morning, a stubborn resolve gripped me. This was bigger than any personal fear. This was about righting an ancient wrong. Yet, as we gathered at the well just before dusk, I couldn't ignore the gnawing sensation in my gut, warning me that once we went down, we might never come back the same, if at all. The descent begins. Under a darkening sky, our small team gathered around the old stone structure. We lit lanterns and strapped on headlamps. Mark anchored the ropes to a sturdy oak tree nearby, testing and retesting the knots. At the well's edge, I peered down and saw nothing but an endless maw of blackness. The moans were quiet in the early evening, as if the spirits were waiting. My hands trembled as I gripped the rope. Sarah went first, descending slowly, her lamp carving out a shaky circle of light against the slick stone walls. Next was Mark, then Donna. I followed, heart hammering, with Caleb coming last. We moved inch by painstaking inch, the centuries-old stones cold and damp beneath our gloved hands. A few feet down, the smell hit us. A pungent mix of earth and decay that made my eyes water. The air felt heavier, as though we were entering a separate realm where time had stood still. Water dripped occasionally from fissures in the stone, creating an eerie echo that magnified every drop. I kept my focus on the rope, trying not to imagine what might be lurking in the dark. But as we descended further, I noticed thin, twisted roots protruding from the walls, like fingers reaching for us. A fleeting thought raced through my mind. This place is alive. At around 20 feet, the moans started again, softly at first, but growing with each step lower. My palms were sweaty despite the gloves, and my breath came in short gasps. I knew this was only the beginning, and a cold fear slid down my spine at what awaited us in the depths. Chamber of bones. It took what felt like an eternity before our feet finally touched something solid. A narrow ledge of collapsed stones. Our headlamps revealed a small chamber at one side of the well shaft, presumably formed by centuries of erosion. The space was large enough for us to stand, albeit hunched over. The first thing I noticed was the unsettling clutter of bones. Some scattered, others in small piles. They ranged from smaller fragments to entire skeletal arms and ribs. My stomach lurched, and Sarah stifled a gasp. This was no mere legend. We were standing amid the final resting place of countless victims, each a testament to cruelty. A dreadful hush fell upon our group. Caleb slowly bent down to examine a skull half buried in the silt. His hands trembled as he brushed away the dirt. The skull's empty sockets seemed to stare back at us, accusing, like it was demanding an explanation for its fate. From somewhere deeper in the shadows, we heard a faint shuffle. My pulse quickened. Could there be something alive down here? Or was it just loose rubble sliding as the earth settled? Donna reached for a cloth bag to begin collecting smaller bone fragments. We planned to bring them to the surface for a proper burial later, but the sheer magnitude of the remains was overwhelming. We'd need a mass excavation team if we truly intended to gather everything. Suddenly, a soft voice echoed, as if whispering right next to my ear. "Thank you." I spun around, shining my lamp frantically, but there was no one there. My heart pounded, a mix of terror and a flicker of hope. Perhaps these spirits understood our intentions, that we were here to help. That knowledge did little to calm my shaking hands, though. Signs of struggle. While Sarah and Donna carefully collected bones, Mark and I ventured deeper into the chamber. The walls narrowed, forcing us into a single-file line. Our lamps revealed gouges in the stone, as if made by desperate fingernails. I shuddered, imagining how these marks were carved. The moans resonated louder now, pulsating through the chamber. At times, the voices overlapped, forming a cacophony of tormented wails. One moment, a sorrowful sob echoed across the stones. The next, a rage-filled shriek reverberated in my skull. Amidst broken bones and rotten timbers, we found remnants of tattered clothing. A frayed sleeve, a scrap of a torn apron. Evidence that these were once people with lives, families, hopes, and fears. I felt a surge of anger at the injustice they'd suffered. Suddenly, Mark called out, voice echoing in panic. "Over here!" I rushed to his side, stepping gingerly over scattered bones. He pointed to a section of the wall where a wooden beam jutted out. It looked like a piece of a crude ladder or platform that had long ago collapsed. Beneath it, we found several skeletons, smaller than the others, children. My stomach twisted in horror. "They threw children down here," Mark said, voice cracking. A chill seized my entire body. The well was not just a dumping ground for criminals or enemies. It was a mass grave for innocence. A swirling vortex of anger, sadness, and guilt threatened to overpower me. That was when I heard a distinct, childlike sob. It was faint, yet unmistakable, carrying an innocence lost to the darkest corners of this pit. I exchanged a horrified look with Mark, realizing that we were in the presence of small spirits, robbed of life before it truly began. Malevolent presence. An oppressive weight seemed to fall upon us, thicker than the stale air. I'd felt sorrow and pity in this place, but now something else slithered into my consciousness. Pure malevolence. It felt like unseen eyes were bearing down on me, evaluating whether I was friend or foe. Sarah let out a strangled cry from the main chamber. We rushed back to find her standing rigid, flashlight trembling in her hand. Her face was pale, eyes wide with dread. Donna stood behind her, equally shaken. Something moved," Sarah whispered, pointing toward a crumbling archway on the far side. I saw a shape, like a shadow or a figure. We all aimed our lights in that direction, but there was nothing but darkness. A tense moment passed, everyone straining to see any sign of movement. That's when the moans rose again, more urgent, almost frantic. The overlapping voices created an eerie chorus that seemed to bounce off every surface, making it impossible to pinpoint a source. Caleb fumbled with the recorder, capturing the audio as best he could, but the device began to flicker, its power draining inexplicably. My grip on the flashlight was so tight my knuckles ached. I could feel something standing among us, or perhaps all around us. Whatever it wasn't just a restless spirit. It felt ancient, vengeful, and hungry. A primal fear welled up in my chest. "Maybe we should go back," Donna said, her voice quivering. "Gather more people, better equipment." But just as she spoke, the shadows seemed to ripple, and an echoing hiss whispered through the chamber. "No escape." A sudden flash of movement in the corner of my vision made my stomach drop. We might not have the option to leave so easily. Trapped in darkness. Before any of us could react, a tremor reverberated through the chamber. Loose stones and dirt rained down from above. The well's aging walls seemed to shift, dislodged by an unseen force. "Move!" Mark shouted, pushing me aside as a large chunk of stone crashed where I'd been standing seconds before. We scrambled back toward the narrow passage that led us here, only to find it partially collapsed. Debris choked the exit, leaving a narrow, precarious gap. Dust filled the air, stinging my eyes and making it hard to breathe. Sarah and Donna pulled at the rocks, trying to clear a path. I joined in, adrenaline spiking as I realized how fragile our lifeline to the surface was. Mark and Caleb shoved from the other side, working frantically to open a gap large enough for us to squeeze through. Amid the chaos, the moans transformed into mocking laughter. Cold, hollow, and full of malice. I couldn't tell if it was in my head or echoing in the chamber. My pulse thundered in my ears, and for a second, I thought I saw a pale hand reach out from the darkness, beckoning. I squeezed my eyes shut, focusing on survival. Finally, the rocks gave way just enough for us to slip through. We emerged, coughing and gasping, back into the main chamber near the ropes. Relief was short-lived. We discovered the ropes had been yanked violently, fraying against the edge. One was completely severed, dangling uselessly. The other was badly damaged. Terror swept through me as I realized that something down here wasn't just restless. It was actively trying to keep us trapped, or worse. Emerging alliances. Panic churned in my gut as we assessed our limited options. We could try to climb with the damaged rope, but if it snapped, well, I didn't dare think about that possibility. Meanwhile, The moans and laughter continued, echoing through the oppressive darkness. Then, a faint voice, different from the menacing laughter, floated to my ears. "We will help." At first, I wondered if I was imagining it, but the others visibly reacted, their heads snapping up. The voice repeated, faint yet resolute, "We will help." An odd sensation stirred in the air, as if invisible hands were guiding us. I looked around, perplexed, until I noticed Sarah's flashlight flicker in one direction, illuminating a hidden recess behind a cracked wall. We approached cautiously, shining our lights into the crevice. The flickering beams revealed another rope, older than anything we'd brought, but coiled neatly, as though placed there for a purpose. It seemed impossible, yet there it was, unmarred by rot or mold. Caleb picked it up, his expression caught between shock and gratitude. "It's in perfect condition," he murmured, running his hand along its length. Somehow, the spirits of the well, those seeking release, were offering us a lifeline, quite literally. The malevolent presence still lurked, but these benevolent souls refused to let it claim us without a fight. In that moment, my fear wavered, replaced by a fragile sense of solidarity with the trapped spirits. We tied the ancient rope to our harnesses, then secured it at the top using the anchor Mark had devised. Each of us exchanged a shaky nod, grateful for the help, yet dreading the path that lay ahead, the deeper descent. With a renewed sense of purpose, we ventured down a secondary shaft discovered behind the broken wall. This new passage sloped downward, away from the main well. The air grew colder, and a thin fog clung to the stones, swirling around our ankles. Every so often, we glimpsed flashes of pale light moving alongside us, a gentle glow that vanished when we turned our heads. It felt like we were being escorted through the bowels of the earth by silent guardians. Still, tension coiled in every muscle. The menacing presence loomed, an oppressive force lurking just out of sight. Occasionally, I heard a whisper that wasn't gentle or comforting. It spoke in a harsh, guttural language I couldn't understand, sending ice down my spine. As we delved deeper, we stumbled upon a cavernous chamber. At its center stood a half-collapsed altar. The walls were etched with unfamiliar symbols, lit by our headlamps in stark relief. It dawned on me that this might have been where the secret council performed their darkest rites, condemning their victims before casting them into the well. My flashlight settled on an ornate metal box resting on the altar's crumbling surface. The box was sealed shut, its lid engraved with the same cryptic symbols. Something inside me said this was important, that it held a secret linking the living and the dead. Before I could move, a sharp, agonized shriek tore through the chamber, nearly splitting my skull. The malevolent force was close, furious at our intrusion. The glow around us flickered, as if the benevolent spirits were struggling to hold back the darkness. We huddled together, hearts pounding, knowing we were on the precipice of a revelation, and a confrontation that could cost us our lives. Confronting the darkness. The shriek intensified, coursing through the cavern like a violent windstorm. Our flashlights flickered wildly, struggling to pierce the suffocating gloom. Then, as if formed from the shadows themselves, a figure manifested, a shifting mass of darkness, vaguely human in outline. I could feel its hatred radiating toward us, a searing presence that made it hard to breathe. My instincts screamed to run, but we stood our ground. Something told me that fleeing would only strengthen its resolve to keep us here forever. Caleb took a bold step forward, raising the ancient rope in one hand like a talisman. "You have no power over those who come to set these souls free," he shouted, voice echoing off the cold stones. The entity recoiled momentarily, as if the rope burned it. Then it lunged, coiling black tendrils of smoke around us, tearing at the edges of our consciousness. I felt my vision waver. The room spun, and I saw flashes of agony. Faces of the condemned, horrifying moments of violence and betrayal. A fleeting thought whispered that we were doomed. Yet, from deep within the cavern, a chorus of faint voices rose. Kind voices, the souls we sought to help. They surged around us like a protective shield, pushing back the darkness bit by bit. I felt their gratitude, their desire for release, and it bolstered my courage. Gritting my teeth, I lunged for the metal box on the altar. I had no idea what it contained, but intuition told me it was crucial. The shadowy figure roared in defiance, but the combined force of the spirits and our determination gave me a split second to lift the lid. Inside lay a faded parchment scroll and a small, rusted key. The scroll contained an incantation, names scrawled in ancient ink. Perhaps those who had once ruled this dark council. My heart pounded. Here, in my hands, was the key to breaking the centuries-old curse. The ritual of release. Clutching the scroll, I could barely read the archaic script in the flickering light. Yet a guiding force, maybe the spirits themselves, seemed to help me understand the meaning behind each cryptic symbol. The incantation called for a ritual of acknowledgement and renunciation of the ancient council's deeds. We gathered in a circle around the altar. Donna, Caleb, Sarah, Mark, and I each placed a hand on the rope, symbolizing unity with the well's trapped souls. My heart hammered so fiercely I wondered if I'd pass out. But time was of the essence. The malevolent shadow loomed just beyond the glow of our flashlights, hissing and writhing. By the names of those cast unjustly, by the bones that cry for rest, we break the hold of tyranny, in darkness no more oppressed. As I recited the words, the parchment glowed with a faint luminescence. The rope in our hands warmed, as though imbued with a newfound power. The chanting voices of the spirits rose, resonating in the chamber like a distant choir. The shadow entity howled, thrashing wildly. Tendrils of darkness lashed out, but they disintegrated upon contact with the rope's light. Energy crackled in the air, a mixture of hope and fury. I raised the rusted key, uncertain of its function. Yet again, a surge of intuition guided me. I pressed it into a keyhole etched into the altar's surface. With a groan of shifting stone, the altar began to collapse, revealing a hidden cavity beneath, a final resting place for the remains that had been desecrated. In that moment, I felt an overwhelming surge of emotion from the countless souls. Relief, gratitude, and sorrow all mingled, creating a wave that nearly overwhelmed my senses. The darkness recoiled further, unable to withstand the collective release of centuries of suffering. A narrow escape, the entire cavern trembled violently. Stones rained down from the ceiling, and deep cracks splintered the floor. The malevolent presence, weakened but still furious, unleashed one last unearthly scream that reverberated through the very foundation of the well. "We have to go now," Mark yelled, grabbing my arm. We dashed back through the twisted corridors, guided by the faint glow of our rope. The spirits that had aided us seemed to clear the path, whispering urgent encouragement in our ears. The malevolent entity thrashed in the distance, but its power waned with each step we took. By the time we reached the main chamber where our exit rope hung, the walls were buckling. Dust choked the air, obscuring our vision. Sarah scrambled onto the rope first, ascending with a determined speed I hadn't seen in her before. One by one, we followed, hands shaking as we pulled ourselves upward. Chunks of stone cracked and fell into the darkness below. My muscles burned, and sweat soaked my clothes. Each foot we climbed felt like a marathon. I didn't dare look down. The horrifying idea of plummeting back into the abyss was too much to bear. At last, we broke the surface, collapsing onto the grassy ground beside the well. Night air hit my lungs like a shock, but it was the sweetest sensation imaginable. The old, rotting wooden cover above the well rattled ominously, then fell in with a resounding crash. A plume of dust rose, and the well seemed to sigh, as if releasing its final breath. We lay there, panting, hearts hammering, alive. The moans were gone, replaced by a profound silence that spoke volumes. Whether or not the well's spirits had found their peace, the centuries-old horror was finally unraveling. Dawn of new voices. Sunlight painted the horizon with a delicate pink glow. We huddled together, cold and exhausted, but filled with a sense of relief and wonder. For the first time in living memory, the old well at the edge of town fell silent. No moans, no anguished cries, just quiet, Over the next weeks, town officials and historians arrived. Proper excavations were organized. Remains were carefully removed, identified where possible, and buried with respect. A plaque was erected, bearing the names of all we could confirm, acknowledging the tragic past that had been hidden for too long. People who'd once avoided the well altogether now visited the memorial, leaving flowers and small tokens. It was as if the entire community needed healing from this dark chapter of our history. And in a way, we all healed together. Yet, even now, sometimes late at night, I catch myself listening. There's no moan, no whisper, but occasionally, I think I hear a gentle sigh on the wind, a soft note of gratitude from those who have finally found rest. It's a reminder of the power of truth and the lengths we must go to confront the horrors of the past. Even though the well no longer calls out in the night, it remains a monument to the many voices that were silenced. And perhaps, in our small act of courage, we've given them back a voice in the present, so they'll never be forgotten.